Alaikum everyone. Hope everyone is still doing fine. This is our third online session as the CMCO is extended for yet another 2 weeks. And I also hope that everyone can manage their time properly. Do your own revision at least an hour a day so that you will have a better understanding of the topics that you have already learned. So we are now in part 3 of chapter 7. Like I said before, in discussing how water is transported in plants, we can actually divide it into 3 different parts, which are the leaf, the stem, and the root. In the previous class, we have already discussed the transport of water from leaf to the atmosphere. We have also looked at some of the unique adaptations that plants living in extreme environment have, right? Those xerophytes plants. So today we are going to continue our discussion by looking at the transport of water in the stem and also in the root. Just to recap back on what we have learned in the previous class, I have here a diagram that shows how water that is lost in transpiration will cause water in the xylem vessel to be drawn out and moves to the mesophyll cells. So if you look at the numbered descriptions here, you will see that everything starts with transpiration, right? What happened in transpiration? In transpiration, water vapor moves out from the air spaces through the stomata and then into the atmosphere. And water vapor that is lost by transpiration will then be replaced by evaporation from the thin layer of water that coats the mesophyll cells. So the large circle that you see in this small box here is actually microfibrils that are made up of cellulose molecule, which is the component of the cell wall, right? And the blue shade that you see here represent the thin layer of water that coats the plant cell on their cell wall. And if you read further on, you will see that the evaporation of water film or the water layer will cause the surface tension to increase and slowly curved inwards. And higher surface tension means that it will be much easier for the water molecules to escape from the plant cells to become water vapor, which will eventually increase the rate of transpiration. The increased surface tension will then pull water from surrounding cells, and eventually the loss of water from these surrounding cells will pull water directly from the xylem vessels. So these are some of the descriptions of the diagram that you saw just now from the previous slide, right? So this explains how water travels from xylem to the mesophyll cells to the air spaces and then evaporates through the stomata. Right? So as water evaporates from the cell walls of mesophyll cells, more water is drawn from surrounding mesophyll cells into the walls to replace it. Eventually, water will be drawn from the xylem vessel in the leaf to the surrounding mesophyll cells. Water constantly moves out of these vessels through the unlignified part, right? Small pores that are known as pits. And the movement of water is down a water potential gradient, because whenever transpiration occurs, there will always be a lower water potential on the leaf, especially in the air spaces compared to the xylem vessel. And water can actually take 2 different paths, in traveling from one cell to another, Those paths are known as symplastic or apoplastic. We are going to discuss this further in the slides that you are going to see after this. Okay, so let's focus on this diagram that I have here. Like I said, the whole concept of water transport in plants occurs from high water potential region to a lower water potential region. And in this diagram, you can see that the lowest water potential region in a plant will be at the leaves with a water potential of about negative 1.5 megapascal. How do the leaf achieve this lower water potential? Obviously, they achieve this through transpiration. And then water will move up in the stem where the water potential here is a bit higher than the leaf, which is about negative 0.6 megapascal. And this will then be followed by the root cells where the water potential is the highest, which is around 0.2 megapascal. So the whole process of water moving in the plant is down the water potential gradient from the root right up to the leaf. Okay, so whenever transpiration takes place, water from the mesophyll cells are lost to the atmosphere, and this will then cause those mesophyll cells to draw water from the nearest xylem vessels in the leaf, right, to replace it, which in return will reduce the hydrostatic pressure of the xylem vessels on the top part of the plant. Okay. So the hydrostatic pressure at the top of the xylem vessel will become lower than the pressure at the bottom. And because of this difference in the water potential gradient between the top part of the plant and the lower part of the plant, water will move up the xylem vessel, right? So the water in the xylem vessels, like the liquid in a suck straw, is under tension. If you suck hard on a straw, its walls may collapse inwards as a result of the pressure differences you are creating. So xylem vessels have strong lignified walls to stop them from collapsing in this way, right? Okay, so the movement of water up through xylem vessel is by mass flow. So what does mass flow means? Mass flow means that all the water molecules and any dissolved substances, any dissolved solutes, move together as a body of liquid, right? Just like water in a river. And this movement of water against gravity up to the top part of the plant is helped by the fact that water molecules are attracted to each other by hydrogen bonding, which created the cohesion force. And the movement is also aided by the ability of water to be attracted by the cellulose and lignin in the walls of the xylem vessels, which created a force known as the adhesion force. And if you still remember, xylem vessel has a lot of small pores known as pits, and these pits allow water to move out of neighboring vessels in case of an airlock. What is an airlock? An airlock is when there is an air bubble inside the xylem vessel. If an air bubble forms in the column of water inside the xylem vessel, the column of water may break, and the difference in pressure between the water at the top and the water at the bottom cannot be transmitted through the vessel. Okay, and the small diameter of xylem vessels also helps to prevent such breaks from occurring. Okay, when we talk or discuss about water transport in plants, there is also a process known as root pressure that helps the water to move upwards against gravity. Because in order to move the water upwards, plants may also increase the hydrostatic pressure difference between the top and the bottom by raising the water pressure at the base of the xylem vessel. How do the plants do this? The plants raise the pressure by a process known as active secretion. What is active secretion? Active secretion is a process whereby uh, plant cells at the root will actively secrete substances or solutes such as ions into the xylem vessels in the root. Right? So cells surrounding the xylem vessels will use energy to pump solutes across their membrane and into the xylem vessel by active transport. And by doing this, it lowers the water potential of the solution in the xylem vessel, thus drawing in water from surrounding root cells. And since there are huge amount of water being drawn into the xylem vessels, it will increase the water pressure at the base of the plant. Okay. So this is just some of the points that we have discussed just now in the previous slide. So I'll leave it for a while for you to read it, or you can always pause the video if you want to copy it, right? Next, we are going to look at the movement of water from the root hair to the xylem vessel. If you look in the diagram that we have here, you can see that water taken up by root hairs will move and crosses the cortex of the root, and then it will enter the xylem in the center of the root. This is because water potential inside the xylem vessel is always lower than water potential in the surrounding region, right? In the cortex as well as the root hair. So the movement of water can take two different paths, okay, through the cortex. They can use the apoplastic pathway, and they can also take symplastic pathway. Okay, I'm going to show you a diagram on what apoplast and what symplast is after this. Right? The cells of the cortex, like all plant cells, are surrounded by cell walls made of several layers of cellulose fibers. They crisscross each other, and water can soak into these cell walls rather as it would soak into blotting paper, and can seep across the root from cell wall without ever entering the cytoplasm of the cortex cells or the cortex region. And this is what we call as the apoplastic pathway. Right? If they move from the root hair into the xylem vessels by means of only the cell walls, so it is known as apoplast, right? Apoplastic. There will be a diagram specifically that is going to show you what apoplast and what symplast is after this. Some descriptions on the movement of water from root hair to xylem that we've discussed just now. As usual, you can read it, or you can pause the video if you want to copy it. So this is a diagram that shows the apoplastic pathway. And like what I've said earlier, apoplastic pathway is when water molecules travels from one cell to another only by means of the cell wall, right? So water molecules never really enter the cells or move into the cytoplasm. So they never really cross the plasma membrane, right? So this is apoplastic pathway. So water enters the cell wall, water moves through the cell wall, water may move from cell wall to cell wall through the intercellular space. So if you can see here, right, there are spaces between the cells. So water can actually move through this space as well. Okay, and water may move directly from cell wall to cell wall. Right? So basically, when you talk about apoplastic pathway, it's going to be the route where water never enters the cytoplasm and never cross the plasma membrane. Okay, so this is the symplastic pathway. Basically, it is an opposite movement or opposite route of the apoplast. Right? When we talk about apoplast, water moves from one cell to another by means of the cell wall. But if you talk about symplast, right, the movement of water must pass through the plasma membrane and move in the cytoplasm, right? So it's as simple as that. Okay, so if you look at the descriptions that we have here, water enters the cytoplasm by osmosis through the partially permeable cell surface membrane. Water moves into the sept in the vacuole, okay, through the tonoplast. Tonoplast is the membrane of the vacuole, and since it moves through these membranes, so it needs to undergo the osmosis process. Okay, then water may move from cell to cell through plasmodesmata. What is plasmodesmata? I've mentioned in the previous topics. Plasmodesmata is a cytoplasmic extension, right, that connects one cell to the other, right? So if you talk about symplastic pathway, okay, water molecules can move through the plasmodesmata as well. Okay, and finally, if you read number 4, water may move from cell to cell through adjacent cell surface membrane, right? So basically, if you talk about symplastic pathway, the most important thing that you need to know is that water must travel through the cytoplasm. Okay. Okay, so once the water reaches the endodermis or the endodermal layer, the apoplastic pathway is abruptly blocked. Why? Because if you look in the diagram that we have here, right, this brown color region in the endodermal layer, okay, this shows that all of the endodermal cells or the endodermis cells is going to be deposited with a chemical substance known as suberin. So suberin is just like lignin. They are waterproof material, right? And because of these deposits on the walls of the endodermal cells, water can no longer travels through the cell wall using the apoplastic pathway. The only way for water to cross now, through the endodermal layer is through the cytoplasm of the endodermal cells. And if you look in the diagram as well, you can see that as the endodermal cells get older, there will be more and more suberin deposited in most of the endodermal cells, right? And most of them will be fully coated, right? Will be fully coated, and therefore they will be fully waterproof and impermeable to water, except in certain cells, right? So these cells that are not fully coated with suberin is known as the passage cells, right? So water can only travel by simplistic means through these passage cells. And this kind of arrangement give a plant control of what type of mineral ions or what kind of substance that can actually pass through the xylem vessel, right? As everything has to cross the cell surface membrane. Okay, and once across the endodermis, water continues to move down the water potential gradient across the pericycle and towards the xylem vessel. And finally, water moves into the xylem vessels through the pits in their walls. It then moves up the vessel towards the leaf, as what we have discussed earlier, right? Because of transpiration. Okay, so again, these are some of the descriptions of the process that we have discussed just now, where water travels through the cortex and into the xylem. Okay, you can write it down, you can pause it, okay, you can view it later. Okay. And finally, we are going to look at the last part of water transport in plant, which is from the soil into the root hair cells. And the concept is quite easy to understand. And it all starts with the movement of water from soil into the root hair cells. In the earlier slides, when we discussed about the type of tissues that can be found in plant, I believe we have also discussed about the epidermis cells, right? And in root, some of these epidermis cells are modified to form a thin and long extension called the root hair, right? So basically, if you talk about root hair cells, they are actually the epidermis cells as well. Okay, and these root hair cells has the ability to reach into spaces between the soil particles from where they absorb water molecules. Although soil water contains some inorganic solution, it is a relatively dilute solution compared to the cells of the root, and therefore has a relatively high water potential. Cell sap in the root hair, in the meantime, have considerable quantities of inorganic ions and organic substances such as proteins and sugars dissolved in them. And this causes these cells to have much higher water potential than the soil, right? So generally speaking, soil have higher water potential. The cells of the root, especially the root hair cells, have lower water potential. So water move into the root hairs by osmosis down a water potential gradient. The large number of very fine root hairs provide a large surface area in contact with the soil, which will increase the rate of water absorption. Okay. Okay, as usual, some of the points that we have discussed just now. Okay, so you can write it down or you can view it later. So the picture that you see here are pictures of root from different types of plant. The one on the left is from a young radish plant, showing the root cap and the root hairs. While the one on the right, okay, is a picture of a root from a type of cottonwood plant. The thing with this plant is that it may seem to have the usual root hairs like any other plants, but in fact, the extensive hairs that you see here are actually a type of fungi known as mycorrhizae, right? Which serve a similar function to root hairs. The mycorrhizae act like a mass of fine roots which absorb water and nutrients, especially phosphate, from soil and pass it to the plant. In return, the plant will provide the fungi with organic nutrients, and this kind of relationship, as you may have learned before, is known as mutualism. Okay. So with that, I think we have covered everything about water transport in this syllabus. In the next class, we are going to look at the transport of organic substances, or better known as translocation. Okay, and before I end the class, there is a video of water transport, and I think it give you a better idea on the whole process, right? So I think that's pretty much it. I will see you again on the last part of chapter 7. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.